So I'm going to talk a little bit today about reading and writing and speculate a bit about the future by looking a little bit through the lens of the past. So data written in books 1,000 years ago are still readable today. But we have to think, what's going to happen to the data that we're creating now? Especially as we move online and everything's digital. Is that going to preserve the information? Will it be accessible 100 years, 1,000 years from now? And if so, how are we going to be creating it? And how will we be consuming it? These are the questions that we're going to contemplate here today. So it's funny, to a computer, right, text, words that we see on the screen that we're so used to, is really an abstract entity. To the computer, it really doesn't have, at the low level, it doesn't really have much of an idea of what text is. It's just streams of zeros and ones, and they add up to become graphemes and characters. But to us, we see the text, right? We recognize it immediately. And as a writer, of course, meaning is everything. The information that we want to represent, though, it's intimately connected to how we store it. And the preservation of and transfer of information is arguably the most important topic to civilization. Thomas Jefferson was famous for saying, so his home in Chadwell had burned down at some point. And when his home burned down, think about this for a second, what do you think about if your residence burned down? He thought immediately about his books. And he said, I cannot live without my books. To him, he most lamented the loss of his books because he knew that the books were the information. And without the information, there were no, back then, right, they didn't have just a backup system. They didn't push it to GitHub or whatever. If the book was burned, the information was gone. And he was a big believer, by the way, in sharing information and copying, because he believed that if you copied information, if you shared information through clones, like forks on GitHub, it was a great way to preserve it, because if you lost it, someone else might have it. And actually, this happened to the KDE project about a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago or so. They had realized that the backups that they had were corrupt. And they went to restore their backups and realized those were corrupt. And so, tracing it back, they said, well, are we going to be able to get back the information for the project? Unfortunately, it was in Get, and someone had cloned it, and many people had cloned it, and they were able to put the clones together to get the information back. So think about how important that is. So information is especially important in our industry. Why is that? Well, I is information. And if you think about it, there's a reason for that. We could very well be the stewards of information. So yes, we think about the technology part, the one on the right, but maybe we need to realize that we have a responsibility towards the word on the left. And it's vital that we call attention to this and that we treat that information responsibly. So one has to wonder, does our choice of communication or method of communicating enhance or deteriorate our ability and effectiveness to communicate? Think about now, when you write a tweet, for instance, or you're writing to a friend, how much time you spend trying to figure out just the right emoji to communicate instead of using the words that you know, paging through the emoji lists. So in the future, in 100 years or 1,000 years, will we be communicating in a language that we know today, or will it be a different language, or will it be some sort of modification? Mandarin, English, emoji. The way my thought about this is that I've been studying French a lot recently. I want to learn another language, and for an American, that's not a normal thing. When you can think about it, you may know a little bit of Italian or Spanish or some language that you might not speak here, but you at least would be able to recognize hello in another language. That's actually not true for a lot of Americans. They couldn't even recognize hello in another language. So, but I want to push it because I think that there's something interesting going on here as I see emoji come up and communication going worldwide. My theory is that we'll actually have a super language. I don't think that English will be the language we'll all speak. I think that we'll speak a language that in the future will combine the beauty of many languages. And you see it here in Morocco. You get to see it because you speak two languages kind of interchangeably daily, and perhaps even more. But For you, you might say, that sounds better in English, so I'll say it in English, and that sounds better in French, I'll say it in French, or Arabic, etc. So maybe we use language as a creative medium, and we don't just think that we all have to be assimilated into one. So in order to predict the future, though, we need to understand the past and how we're connected to it. So we're connected to some of our earliest ancestors at Chauvet Cave in France, 30,000 years ago. No, yes, it's sometimes hard to say it. 30,000 years ago, by information. The people who resided in those caves, they're long since perished, and hardly, if any, evidence of their bodies remain. But what does remain is the information that they captured and, more importantly, decided to share. So we see the world not through their eyes, because there's no way for that to happen, but we see it through the media and the information that it portrays. So information is so powerful because it's a liaison between lives. It connects us when it can be there when you aren't there. But what's important, too, about this information is that right away, even though it's 30,000 years ago, you instantly recognize what you're looking at. You instantly see the horses. And we were really ignorant of their lives, but somehow we shared the world in the same way, and we shared a world that was the same. But it's when we see the prints of the hands in the cave that we truly feel something. Writing is so powerful and so timeless. And what's beautiful about this is that if you use information well, then your audience can feel that emotion just as you feel when you see this. Because you sense their presence behind that. So if we saw a picture of the horse before, you say, okay, yes, that's what I see. I see what you see. But when you see the picture of the hand, you sense that there must have been a person standing at that wall at some point. And this is such a powerful thing. So when I was in high school, this was the computer that I used. And now we kind of look at it and say, wow, that thing is huge on the desk. We all have the laptops are even smaller. But the interesting part wasn't necessarily the computer, but it was how we were getting information out of the computer. So I wrote in a program at that time called ClarisWorks. It's much like Microsoft Office is today. But when I wanted to share it, I had to use this device. Actually, it looked a little bit more like this when you were about to print something. That was our share button back then, because there was no way for us, once we had it on the computer, it's in digital form, but there was no way, unless I could give someone else my computer, that I could give them the document very easily. Nowadays, we take this for granted. We almost share by default. We write in the medium of the online experience. So we never really have this problem anymore. And to a large degree, we enjoy the benefits of a typewriter today without any of its limitations. Now, if you look at this particular photo, there's a couple of funny things about it. So this was an advertisement at a World's Fair for a typewriter. And look at underneath the name of the typewriter, the very first point, visible writing. Probably kind of the most important thing, right? That it was actually visible. I would kind of assume that if we were talking about a typewriter, that would be understood. Otherwise, what am I writing in invisible ink? A universal keyboard, and if we were to zoom in on it, what we would see is that it has about 26 characters. Actually, there were even less. There were somewhere around 20 characters. They didn't even have all the letters to write English. That's not very universal. So writing, it's very important that writing is universal. And speed and touch, of course, things that we value tremendously today. But what's beautiful about the web now, right? I mean, we've come such a long way in such a short period of time, isn't necessarily that we can easily connect with each other online, but that we can all be publishers for nothing. So think about what the possibilities here are for creating businesses. You don't need to get by web hosting, and you don't need to become a publishing house to communicate with people. If you were writing a book, you don't need a publisher. Services like GitHub Pages make it possible for anyone to be a publisher without even worrying about paying for hosting. You just put it in a Git repository, and immediately you have a website. So you can really, to tie in from the last talk, if you have this idea, it costs nothing to try something new, to experiment, to just put a website out there and see if people are interested. Matthew Butterick, who's the author of Practical Typography, which is a fantastic book, I highly recommend reading it. He's very sarcastic and very funny. He proposes the idea that the web is all we need for publishing. So he says printed books are on their way out. Well, they've been saying this for many years, and it's going to be a long, slow process. And that's not necessarily a hostile thing against books. Some people like books, but that's not the point here. What we're really saying is, if we were to publish in some other way, how do we pay each other? Because before, when we had books, right, we had this thing and say, here, I have this, and if you want this, you need to give me money. So it's a physical thing. But now we talk about online, we talk about access. So how are we going to exchange books in this world? So think about how you get a digital book today. You probably get it from a store like iBooks or Amazon Kindle or something. But in a way, books before, okay, even back to, you think about Chauvet Cave, right? They didn't have a physical book, they just had a wall, and they just put it up there. They didn't ask Amazon if they could put something on the wall. They just painted it there. So in a way, we kind of feel like in order to write, you need these publishers, you need to go to, put it in the marketplace of Kindle. Forget about it. Choose a world of digital books that are controlled by a handful of technology behemoths, and they determine what gets sold, how you read it, what format you're going to get, and how you pay for it. Or we can use the web, going back to this slide, where writers can publish whatever they want, readers can read whatever they want, and probably the most important part is that we can work out with each other how to pay for it. Maybe we have the micropayments right on the website. Okay, we have frameworks for everything, right? We have frameworks for all of these different things. Technologists can solve that problem by sharing with each other technologies. We don't need to have necessarily Amazon Kindle to build an Amazon Kindle experience. Now, when you're working, I've often heard this. So this is the other thing that's challenging about publishing in the web world, is that people say, well, there's so many devices. Okay, in the short period of time we've had devices so far, we have a gazillion screens already. In 20 years, 100 years from now, we're going to have every screen size that can possibly exist in your sphere of view, okay? So if you were to say, no, I really wish that one day we'll have a standard screen size, that is completely crap. That's never going to happen. I mean, come on, how are you going to convince the whole world to all agree on one size of phone? So instead, what we want to do is we realize that we don't have control over the screen size. And so what we want to do is when we create information, it has to be responsive, it has to be adaptable, and it's going to be in formats that we can't even imagine today. Maybe, Google Glass was a great example where all of a sudden we weren't working with screens that we touched anymore. So if we had designed for a phone, it's not going to work on Google Glass very well, and that's just the beginning of it. So we really want to make sure that the information that you're trying to share doesn't care about the medium. Maybe it adapts or looks a little bit different on each medium, but it's not stuck on one of them. Because if you're stuck on one of these screen sizes, then you're dead to everyone else. And if you think about it, the web has really worked for many years for one main reason, is that it's reflowable, right? The web can kind of just take information and kind of lay it out however. And we're able to pull it up on any tablet or whatever, and we can read it. Except for those websites that try to fix you into a box, and then it looks terrible. So don't do that. The web works great by default. Don't try to make it fit people into a little box. And something that Heather had mentioned in yesterday's keynote, people are not going to settle for something. Once they see something that's brilliant, they're not going to settle for something that's less than brilliant. So once people have seen the web, they're not, if you've ever used one of these ebook readers, right, you sort of say, hey, this works a lot. The web works better than this ebook reader, right? That's what people think. They don't think, wow, this ebook reader is so amazing because it does all these things. No, they think, okay, when I scroll, it doesn't smooth scroll. It's like real jerky. Because they've been on the web, and they know that the web has these features, so they're not going to accept that. So really, it's about, you have to be able to adapt or die. And this applies for so many things, but information is so important. The information has to be able to adapt. It has to adapt to different audiences. It has to adapt to different screen sizes, etc. Or else it's done. So what technology does this throw away right away? If you have to adapt to a screen size, what technology is hostile to adaptation of screen sizes? Well, think about PDFs. So when we think about the future of publishing and what formats we're trying to convert our writing into, PDF is fundamentally a simulation of paper. I mean, it removes functionality and it imposes design constraints, so it's backwards looking. And so the lesson that we should learn from PDF, just as in the previous keynote, Blockbuster, etc., they were a backwards looking technology. They wanted to give you a physical DVD or VHS cassette tape for you to take home and watch. Once the internet existed, then that was a completely crazy idea that you would have to drive down to the store to pick up something that has information on it, which could have come over the internet. So you have to be very careful and recognize when you're in a backwards-looking situation. And PDF is a great example of a backwards-looking format. It's never going to work on all these different devices. I mean, if you've ever tried to do it, you're zooming in and zooming out, it doesn't work. One of the things that I find funny, so I wrote a book once, and prior to publishing, we got to a certain stage in the publishing process, and the publisher said, you can make 20 edits per chapter before this goes to production. 20 edits per chapter. Imagine saying to a developer, you can only make 20 changes to the source code prior to this, then when we put it in production. I mean, it's like you've exceeded your quota of changes, and why do we have a quota of changes? Because they were using some backwards-looking process that required a bunch of manual steps, okay? So the people that are going to be successful in the publishing industry are going to be ones that be like, hey, change it whenever you want. And then you're going to get the writers. You're going to have opportunity. But also look for this. Institutions, this is the Shirky principle. I love this. Institutions will try to preserve the problem to which they're the solution. Okay, so when you have to recognize when you're in those situations, you're like, why are someone advocating for this not to change? Maybe it's because, okay, do we think like oil and gas industry? Okay, maybe the institutions, oil and gas, are trying to preserve oil and gas because they are the solution to the problem of not having oil and gas. So we don't need them. And this is kind of, sort of looking a little bit at today, but imagine you're reading a document or reading a book or whatever. How many times have you thought, well, I'm just a consumer. Yet then I turn around and on the web, I get to always be sharing. So maybe we need to get to a point where we do it more like GitHub, where, okay, I see a change, I fork and edit, etc., send a pull request, etc. But why are there certain cases where that's not allowed? I can't talk back to this writer. I can't tell the writer, maybe it's a technical book that you're reading and you find an error and you want to tell the reader, why can't you just fork and edit right inside the app? This has done wonderful things for code, so maybe it would do great things for writing too. This is an interesting phenomenon that's happening here when we think about it. So this is actually the Moby Dick, and it was translated into Emoji. And this is in the Library of Congress. Now, first of all, what a ridiculous thing. I mean, there's a book that was translated into emoji, and it's in a serious library like the Library of Congress. But maybe what we're seeing here is we're seeing pushing the boundaries here. Maybe someone's not happy. We talk about, what languages do you know? English, French, Arabic, etc. But what if none of those languages are good for us? What if we need a new language? What if we need, maybe not a new language, but we need enhancements to the language? Should we have characters in our language? Well, the Chinese and the Japanese will tell you, we always had that in our language, so I don't know why you don't have that. So maybe we can only express ourselves if we have symbols in some cases. Perhaps in the future we could be writing on let me give you a specific example from that. So this was an example, call me Ishmael. And the reason I bring this up is that you've written a tweet that's like this. Everyone's done it. I'm going to go all emoji on this one. I'm going all in on the emoji. Just put this one up there for a second. Standards committees. You got to love them. You can imagine people sitting around and saying, what characters do we need to represent in emoji? And someone being like the pile of shit person. Like, I definitely need that emoji. And we're going to get that in there. Now, we sort of laugh about it, but there's something really tragic about this. That is in standard Unicode, okay? However, there are still symbols that are not in Unicode that are necessary to write people's names in various languages, including Chinese and Japanese. Should that be the case? Should someone tell you that you can't write your name because your name has characters in it that aren't yet standardized, that aren't yet part of the modern languages? So we have to be very careful as this kind of ties back to speaking directly to you as technologists. You have to realize that you're affecting the ability for not technology, the world, and not just the current world, but the future world, to be able to communicate. And if you have wars and fight over it and end up with characters like this, but you're missing characters we need to transcribe and manuscripts that are dying, and you can't get those characters in Unicode, then the technology part of the information technology has failed the information part of information technology. So we kind of have to sit back and think a little bit, how are we going to write in the future? Will we write on a tablet? Will we write on a phone? Will we write on our wrist? A TV? A spatial operating environment where we can move things around, like in Minority Code? Holographic displays? Dictating? I was just talking with my friend earlier today, and we said, isn't it kind of strange that we say, we have a meeting, and then we ask, hey, was that recorded? And then we didn't record it, and then, okay, well, did anyone take any notes? What if we had a recording of everything we ever said? Not that it was automatically shared with the world, but for ourselves. I would have a device. I already have a device in my pocket, but everything I said is recorded. That way, if I ever said anything that a good business idea or whatever, I could go back to it. Okay, well, going back through my transcripts would require me to do stuff in real time, and that doesn't make a lot of sense because I'd have to relive my life. But don't we have computers doing things like crunching big data? That's kind of their thing, right? So what if something was transcribing everything I said, and then it would send back to me a report of all the things I had said, and it would say, hey, you had said earlier today, I have this brilliant idea, and this was the text that came after it. And this was fairly similar to something you said 2 weeks ago, and actually I now see there's a connection here. Maybe you'd be interested in this. Okay, so we're still creating the information, but the computers are helping us understand it. Nicholas Negroponte predicted in a TED Talk a couple of years ago that in 30 years we would ingest knowledge instead of just reading it, like swallow a pill to learn Shakespeare. I sure wish I could do that to learn French. So, language, we have to always remember, is the gateway to accessing life and society itself. It's the reason we're connected with our earliest ancestors. And you guys, as technologists, remember that information part of IT. Remember that this is an important thing. Whatever path we take, this is absolutely imperative. The writing system of the 21st and 22nd century, and so forth, it needs to be driven by the needs of the people using it, okay? We don't want to be ending up with a bunch of piles of poo, right? What we want is meaningful ways of sharing information. And the other thing is to go back to that idea of who controls this stuff. As engineers, you should always remind yourself of this every day. This should be your daily aspiration. And it applies to this, it applies to anything that you do. If you treat limitations, if you look at it and you say that's a limitation, the fact that my phone has this glass screen is a limitation. If we look at that as something to obey and not to overcome, we'll just be indentured to whoever controls that technology. Instead, what we look at is to always be breaking the limitations. So think broadly and think openly. Thank you. Yeah, I think, I guess we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, I'd be glad to hear them. Yes?
Can you share some information with us? Who are you? What are you doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So most people know me as the lead of the ASCII Doctor ecosystem. And we started out just working on a writing format. ASCII Doc is very similar to Markdown. And I think along the way, what we realized is that what we really want to do, yeah, a syntax, that's nice. That's kind of a low-level detail. We want to help people communicate better. And I specifically focus in my business on helping companies that run open source projects communicate with each other. But as I get deeper and deeper into it, I realize how much more we could be doing with content to make businesses succeed, to make projects succeed, to make communities succeed than we're doing today. Even coming down to being able to be on stage and sharing information and knowing that behind every great talk is a narrative that was written, and there needs to be an arc and a journey that we take people on. So I'm getting more and more interested in, obviously, as I mentioned, information technology in the technology space, but the information part of technology and how we share that information and teaching people how to use words as a tool to connect with users and other community members. And my name is Dan Allen. So you notice I never start my talks out with who I am. Again, it goes back to, I think, what we're trying to achieve here, which is putting information before the individual, putting the idea before the individual that's sharing it. Because what's really, really important is the idea, not necessarily who I am. I mean, other people can take this idea and pass it on, and that'd be brilliant. That's what makes ideas successful, is when other people get inspired by them and they want to pass them on. So I think that what's most important is the idea that I have to share, not necessarily who I am.